Hello, as far as I see today, there's one big story, which is the conflict in the Middle East, but there are three strands to it. There's the British political strand, because Keir Starmer did a news conference in Downing Street. There's a Donald Trump strand, because he's been saying a few things since we last recorded an episode of Newscast. He's also preparing to do a big statement to the American people on Thursday night. And then there's just what's happening in the global economy as more and more consequences of the conflict are being felt in various parts of the world. So we will draw those three different strands together for you on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
Hello, it's Henry Zeffman here in Westminster.
And this is Lyse Doucet. I'm in London.
And we're also joined by Michelle Wiese Bockmann, who's the Senior Maritime Intelligence Analyst at Windward. Hello again, Michelle.
Hi, Adam.
So we've got a maritime expert, an international diplomacy expert, and a political expert. And those are the three big strands that we're going to pull apart, but also then probably tie back up together on this episode of Newscast. Lyse, first of all, we should say we're recording this episode of Newscast on Wednesday afternoon, just after lunchtime. The big thing that is probably going to happen in the middle of the night on Thursday, though, which is Donald Trump doing a statement from the Oval Office. But in the meantime, he has said plenty of quite dramatic things in other forums, whether on interviews or on social media. One of the big things is he says he's thinking about pulling out of Nato. What do you make of that?
So his exact wording, and I think these days we really have to look at his exact wording. He said, "I'm strongly considering pulling out of the NATO military alliance." In fact, he added on to it and said, "It's beyond reconsideration." If you look back at what President Trump has said in this term and also in his first term, he often takes out this threat to leave the 77-year-old military alliance. And apparently, he just about did it in his first term. The former Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, wrote in his memoir that he had to literally pull President Trump back from the brink of leaving the alliance. And in his telling, Jens Stoltenberg went on Fox News and he said it all in his memoir. He said, I was only thinking of one television viewer, and that was President Donald Trump. And he credited the US president and commander-in-chief for really pushing other NATO members to step up considerably their military spending. And apparently President Trump was watching. He tweeted out his acknowledgement of the praise on Twitter. And then Jens Stoltenberg writes that President Trump didn't give the speech that had already been drafted by the White House to announce he was pulling out. So he's announcing now he's going to pull out. This time, I think he's even angrier because his NATO partners have not enthusiastically joined his war against Iran alongside Israel. And that is because, one, they were never consulted on this war. And two, they still really, like all of us, don't really know what the end game is. What are the main goals in this war? And quite frankly, President Trump only looked to his NATO members when he realized he was in trouble with the Strait of Hormuz, and that he looked to them to try to get them to help him to get Iran from stop blocking the maritime traffic in this critical waterway. The last thing I will say is that he said in his remarks to the Telegraph, he said, "I thought it should be automatic," which betrays yet another misunderstanding that Trump has of the military alliance. And those who do know the alliance will say that in their founding treaty, there was this principle of collective defense, that an attack on one is an attack on all. It will be invoked when there is a consensus among NATO members. It's only been invoked once in its long history, and that was after the September 11th attacks in the United States. But what after another NATO member said, "This is not our war. What's happening now is not NATO's war."
And of course, Lyse, there'll be a whole lot more to say about Donald Trump's position when he addresses the American people in the middle of the night, UK time.
It's interesting. Everyone waits with bated breath to see what President Trump says next. It's become a bit of a pastime for journalists and pundits, I think people the world over. And the difficulty for all of us is that he keeps changing his mind, or he keeps repeating the same things over and over again. Take one of them that he said when it was announced that he'd make the speech. He then said, well, I'm going to end the war very soon. And then he says, maybe in the next 2 or 3 weeks. It's almost exactly the same wording he used on March the 9th when he said oil prices, the stocks rose, oil prices fell. President Trump announced on CBS News, I'm going to end the war very soon. I can end it pretty quickly, he said. But if you go down and read exactly what he said in that interview to CBS News, when the correspondent pressed him, well, how are you going to end the war? He said, oh, it's only in my mind. I don't know if it's in anyone else's mind, which made you realize that he was just musing about something which, as we all know, is a very, very consequential war, which is he doesn't call it a war, obviously, that should be pointed out too, very, very consequential military operations causing economic shocks the world over, including here in Britain, and obviously raising tensions with his partners, including Britain.
So we're waiting to hear from Donald Trump in his statement from the Oval Office, which will be on Thursday night. We've already heard from Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, who did a news conference in the press conference room in Downing Street. Henry, you were there. Let's listen to one of the dramatic bit of this news conference, because it was all quite kind of detail focused. But Keir Starmer did this assessment of what's heading our way economically.
It is now clear that the impact of this war will affect the future of our country. So today I want to reassure the British people that no matter how fierce this storm, we are well placed to weather it.
And Henry, I suppose the Prime Minister wants people to focus on the second half of that sentence, which is the reassurance message. I think I was focusing on the first half, which was, oh, things are going to get rockier.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the purposes of this press conference, Adam, was for the Prime Minister to just seed that idea in people's minds that this is going to be quite a profound economic moment. And while the Prime Minister dedicated a lot of, at least his opening comments, to reassuring people, or he hoped it would be reassuring about various measures that the government has taken that are coming into effect either today because it's April the 1st or next week because that's the start of the tax year, which he believes will ease the cost of living. As he acknowledged, none of those announcements were new. And I think he was beginning just to plant the idea among people that this government is going to have to and will take extra measures before long to respond to what he called a coming storm. And he said it might be fierce. So for all that the Prime Minister wanted to talk about reassurance here, for all that this government, unlike some other governments, is not taking emergency measures yet, it felt, certainly in the room, like quite a gloomy and pessimistic message that the Prime Minister was delivering.
And it was quite different. Well, I suppose actually it was very similar to the address that we got overnight, Tuesday into Wednesday, from the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, in terms of it was preparing people for a situation to get worse. But Anthony Albanese went further about advice for how to deal with potential squeezes on the supply of fuel, and also in terms of what the Australian government was going to do to help people with the cost of living. So let's have a little listen to the tone that was coming from Canberra.
You should go about your business and your life as normal. Enjoy your Easter. And if you're hitting the road, don't take more fuel than you need. Just fill up like you normally would. Think of others in your community, in the bush, and in critical industries. And over coming weeks, if you can switch to catching the train or bus or tram to work, do so. That builds our reserves and it saves fuel for people who have no choice but to drive. Farmers and miners and tradies who need diesel every single day. And all those shift workers and nurses who do so much for our country. The months ahead may not be easy. I want to be upfront about that. No government can promise to eliminate the pressures that this war is causing. I can promise we will do everything we can to protect Australia from the worst of it. These are uncertain times, but I'm absolutely certain of this. We will deal with these global challenges the Australian way, working together and looking after each other, as we always have.
And Henry, the Australian way is to quite gently tell people to save fuel, to save petrol and diesel. That doesn't seem to be the British way at the moment.
No. And, some countries are going the British way and some countries are going the Australian way. It's interesting, not just because Australia is a country which has taken a different approach to the UK, but also because actually, if you'd asked me at any point really to identify one government around the world from which Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party here most openly takes inspiration on public policy and on politics more generally, it is the Albanese Labour government in Australia. So it is quite striking that they've ended up in a different place on this. I was also very struck this morning. I saw some comments from one of the European commissioners yesterday. Now, this isn't sort of formal EU policy, but urging people to work from home, to drive less, to drive more slowly when they do drive, to fly less. And so you have an Australian ally, you have the EU, with which Sir Keir Starmer was clear in this press conference at a later point he wants to get much closer, in quite a different place to the UK. And so, that's a big call that Keir Starmer has made.
And we'll come on to the EU angle in a second because it was very interesting. But Michelle, this is where geography explains politics, doesn't it? Because actually Australia, because of where it is and where it gets its oil and gas from, is actually a little bit more exposed to the forces that have been unleashed by the war between the US and Iran.
Yeah, completely. And Australia has shut down a lot of its refineries, which is making it even more reliant on diesel and gasoline and transportation fuels from Asian countries. And of course, a lot of those countries have now stopped their refineries exporting those products. And so they're having to source from the United States and other places where they're in competition with the UK. So yes, and I can just, on a personal note, my husband's still stuck in Australia and he's reporting panic buying. So, there's another Australian way underway there as well.
Interesting. So you can see Anthony Albanese is responding to actually quite a different situation from the one Keir Starmer is responding to today.
Yeah, completely.
And then, Henry, just in terms of the domestic British politics, it does seem all the other political parties across the UK, because there are elections coming up across the UK on May the 7th, are pushing for more action.
Yeah, particularly, well, there's two kind of categories. There's household energy bills and then there's prices at the pump. And when it comes to household energy bills, Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, who gave a couple of interviews to the BBC today, have been clear that support is going to come, but it will be targeted at those who are worst off, and it won't take effect until the autumn. So the energy price cap, which took effect today for most households, means that actually prices are falling for the next 3 months, and then inevitably they will go up. But Keir Starmer is saying, actually, wait for the autumn because the current energy price cap is going to elapse in July. Well, that's the summer. People are less likely to stick on the heating then. And therefore, it's the autumn that really matters. Now, there are various political parties who, both to Labour's left and to their right, who think that's inadequate. And then there's prices at the pump. And this is an interesting one. I mean, as it stands, the government is theoretically committed to increasing fuel duty by 1p in the pound in September, and then it going up again in increments over the coming months. There is no one, literally no one I speak to at Westminster who thinks that is going to happen. Keir Starmer has said it's under review. I suspect at some point before long he will confirm that it's not going to happen, but clearly he doesn't want to do so now, and that has been one line of attack from other parties. And then there's that broader debate that we've spoken about before that I think is going to be one of the debates of 2026 in the UK, which is about the government's energy policy more broadly and whether it has the right mix and whether it is doing the right things in terms of the balance between renewable and non-renewable forms of energy.
And just to be explicit about where the other political parties are, the Conservatives and Reform UK are both calling for VAT to be taken off household energy bills, and that proposed hike in fuel duty due in September should be cancelled. The Liberal Democrats are also calling for that increase in fuel duty not to go ahead, and it sounds like Ed Davey is preparing to call for some big emergency tax cuts in the next couple of days. The Greens say that the government should spend billions of pounds to make sure that domestic energy stays at the level of the price cap where it is now. because it's meant to go and is likely to go up in July. Plaid Cymru say that they would like to see the government doing more support for energy users in Wales, and the SNP have been arguing that all of this proves that the Scottish government should have more control over energy policy. Right, let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz. Michelle, can you give us a bit of an update about how open or closed or in between that waterway is at the moment?
Sure. So Iran really has the world over a barrel, is my conclusion. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps controlled corridor that they put in place around, the 15th of March, that's being consolidated. It's a permission-based transit system. There's about a dozen vessels going through, inbound and outbound daily. That's about 92% drop in established transits. Those ships that are getting through are linked to China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all their vessels that are supplying agricultural products to or from Iran, and allies or non-aligned countries who have done deals in order to get cargo in and out. And really, it's kind of like the Houthis playbook of the Red Sea, but on steroids. And I can see, no evidence that this is going to get any better, really. Perhaps, if anything, we will see more cargoes coming through this permission-based system, and perhaps even tolls levied as well.
And I suppose even if we end up in a more sort of stable situation where there were more ships going through and they're probably having to pay a toll to the Iranians or the IRGC to get through safely, as you said, that's still a tiny fraction of what would normally be going through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, the rules are also really unclear and ambiguous. And interestingly, some of the bulk carriers that are going through are grease-owned. So that's suggesting that there's complex commercial and government negotiations going underway with banks and marine insurers. And, older ships are being used. There's also a lot of dark transits, vessels that are going through without their vessel tracking transponder on. And, but in terms of Iranian oil, it's business as usual. I've seen while everybody else's cargo is being held up, Iranian energy commodities, liquefied petroleum gas, crude, petroleum products, that's all getting through, in the same numbers as before.
And Lyse, one of the other things that came out of Keir Starmer's news conference in London on Wednesday morning was that the British Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper is going to host this virtual meeting with 35 countries who have an interest in keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. What's a way of thinking about the consequences of that and all these other countries potentially getting involved in the region, but not now, and certainly not in an offensive way in the joining the conflict with Iran?
I think what we are seeing now is that a number of countries, including Britain, are trying to draw a line between this general war against Iran alongside Israel, which many countries, including Britain, still have reservations about this war. But because what was widely described as a war of choice unleashed on February the 28th by the United States and Israel has now turned into a war of necessity because Iran has successfully shifted it to it's weaponized the Strait of Hormuz. And Britain and other, not just NATO members, but countries around the world have an interest in keeping this crucial waterway open. And of course, we should also underline that what we have also seen when Britain did eventually offer its bases, offer its aircraft, it's because it also has to be seen to be helping out its critical allies in the Gulf. If they were just standing idly by while they came under attack from Iranian missiles, this would live long in the memory. So we're seeing a bit of a scramble as countries, including Britain, trying to decide, well, what is in our national interest, what is legal, and what really matters now. And so to the Strait of Hormuz, I think military experts would say that it is really really risky, costly, and not necessarily effective in the long run to try to open the strait militarily. But it will need at some point a diplomatic solution. As we already heard, some countries are getting their tankers and other vessels through because they're talking to Iran. And if you look at what happened in the other strait, which may become a household name like the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, when the Houthis in Yemen were able to significantly disrupt traffic there between 2023 2025, the European Union did organize a defensive naval operation in that around that crucial waterway. How much it's achieved, that would still be discussed, but they did move together and try to move some vessels into that crucial area in order to protect the Bab al-Mandeb. So I think this is what Britain wants, not just to do something, but be seen to do something. And of course, President Trump goes back and forth. Mid-March, he did say, you need to come and help me, Strait of Hormuz. And then one of the things he's been saying again in the last few days is, well, I don't care about the Strait of Hormuz. I'm going to make a deal, even if the strait remains shut, because it's not my oil. We're not worried about that oil, which is to some extent true. It's largely European countries. Asian countries in particular are really affected, and most of all China, although it has more buffers than some other Asian states. So he's saying to them, it's your issue. And then the next day he says something different.
Although, Henry, it was intriguing, Keir Starmer talking about the Strait of Hormuz, because he was very much sticking to his line of, this is not our conflict, we're not going to get involved. Then you read about this, and you might call it the coalition of the willing for the Strait of Hormuz, that it's about creating some kind of stable situation after the fighting has ended. But then at the same time, Starmer said today at that news conference to you guys in the room, it is in Britain's national interest to make sure that there's freedom of navigation for international shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, which to me sounds like a rationale for intervening militarily, potentially before the conflict has ended. Because if it's in Britain's national interest to keep ours and everyone else's economies going.
I guess the implication of his position is that he doesn't believe that a British military intervention before the end of a conflict would make it more likely that the Strait of Hormuz opens up. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right that is an element of the government's position that merits further scrutiny. I mean, by the way, one other thing that the Prime Minister said quite late on in the press conference about the Strait of Hormuz that was interesting, other people have said this, but I don't think Keir Starmer has said this before, was he said, just because the conflict might end, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Strait of Hormuz would then open. And as I say, some analysts and other world leaders I've heard mention that possibility. But I think that was another gloomy moment from the Prime Minister, which spoke to how gloomy and pessimistic they are in government, at least in some of the scenarios that might transpire. I just thought that was an interesting moment to mark.
Michelle, Lyse mentioned the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the waterway off the coast of Yemen, so is affected by whatever the Houthis do. Tell us a little bit more about that and why that might become the next infamous choke point.
The Houthis discovered very early on that they could get themselves a very big international profile by disrupting global trade that goes from Asia through to Europe via the Strait and then Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And they attacked or threatened to attack any vessels, Western affiliated vessels or those linked to Israel. And so traffic at its worst was down 70%. And then with the ceasefire in Gaza, traffic had just started coming back and it was down about 60%. And now, of course, with their re-entering the war, a lot of European and Western affiliated ships have therefore decided to go around the Cape of Good Hope as well.
And Michelle, every day it seems to be there's a different focus on a different commodity that might be running out somewhere as a result of all of this. You hear people talking about, potentially it could be medicines in the UK in a few months' time, or it could be fuel for commercial jets in a few weeks' time. What things have you got your eye on?
Well, I'm actually watching jet fuel really closely, and that's because jet fuel storage isn't really available. It degrades very quickly. And so when you look at jet fuel on the water, it has plunged extremely quickly. And for example, I measure long range tankers. They're the tankers that ship refined products from the west to east or east to west. And on March 20, there were 78 of those tankers on the water with jet fuel. And then when I did the numbers again on March 28, there were only 22. So there is a looming crisis for global airlines because of the availability. And of course, prices have doubled. So that's, I think, the most critical area to watch at the moment.
Right, because the jet fuel flows around the world's oceans kind of in real time.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
It dropped dramatically.
Henry, the other thing that really made my ears prick up at Keir Starmer's news conference was he was super enthusiastic about the UK's relationship with the EU and deepening that, even more so than Rachel Reeves was a couple of weeks ago, where she said one of her big focuses was going to be on alignment with the EU's standards.
Yeah, I mean, let's just be clear first. I agree it was really interesting and important, but actually the substance of what the Prime Minister said on the EU, nothing there was new. He was talking it up rhetorically, but we already knew there was going to be the second annual UK-EU summit around about May or June. We already knew that there were various negotiations underway triggered at the first annual UK-EU summit almost a year ago, which are going to come to completion then. We already knew that the UK wanted to announce further areas of negotiation to get close with the EU headed into a third one. So none of that was new. However, the decision of the Prime Minister to emphasise all of that in today's press conference, a press conference that was called in the context of a spiralling conflict about which the UK and the US disagree, was deliberate and was clearly meaningful, because I think it was the Prime Minister stressing that one of perhaps the key solution he sees to an economy which has suffered from sluggish growth for some time and in his eyes is probably going to be set back further by this conflict and its fallout. Well, he sees one of the solutions to that as a much closer relationship between the UK and the EU. And clearly, seen in that new context, this is especially significant.
And I suppose the proof of that pudding will be when this summit happens in a few weeks' time, the declaration or the document that comes out of it. How long is the joint to-do list between Brussels and London about new areas of cooperation to explore and how deep that cooperation is going to be? That'll be when we'll be able to see in black and white what they've really got planned.
And what does the EU want in return? Because as you know better than me, Adam, from your years in Brussels. No, definitely better than me. You had binders and everything. You know that the EU, plays a tough negotiating hand. I mean, some of the negotiations which Keir Starmer was talking up today, which will come to fruition at that summit, there are big disagreements still outstanding. For example, youth mobility. Where there's going to be some sort of deal for young people to move between the UK and the EU. The UK wants that to be capped. The EU doesn't. And that is still outstanding in the weeks before this summit takes place. And I wonder, and I no stronger than that, but I wonder whether now that Keir Starmer has put it essentially publicly at the heart of his economic agenda in response to this conflict, well, does that mean the EU knows that he really is desperate for some of these deals, so they have a stronger hand to play? And of course, worth also saying, because there was a brief moment where it sort of almost appeared that Keir Starmer wasn't ruling out membership of the single market. And then, pressed on it by another journalist, he made clear that actually he was ruling it out. So he said that Labour's 2024 election manifesto commitments still stand, which is to say no membership of the customs union, no membership of the single market. But from the sounds of things, he wants the UK to get as close as possible to the single market without full membership, which of course would come with free movement of people, among other things. Well, Theresa May sought something not that dissimilar to that some years ago, and we ended up with endless rows about cherry picking, because the EU's view is that the UK shouldn't have all of the perceived benefits of the single market without all of the perceived drawbacks. So I think those are all debates that are clearly going to start playing a much bigger role in British political life all over again.
All I'll say is, from the Brexit era, there is a binder, not on my old shelf, but on the European Commission's shelf, for a UK-wide alignment to lots of rules on the single market that we used to call the UK-wide backstop, which was designed so that it wasn't just Northern Ireland that was following all those rules, but the whole of the UK. So there is a ready-made solution sitting, waiting to be dusted off.
And Adam, this is a question that I can't quite remember the answer to, but you might. Did the Labour Party, when Sir Keir Starmer was its shadow Brexit secretary, vote against that?
I can't remember. But let's check Hansard.
One for a future newscast.
And also, what exactly form would that vote have taken?
Yeah.
Because actually, that was
it meaningful vote 2 or 3?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember which version of the deals
Happy
actually got
days,
voted on.
maybe.
Lyse, don't laugh.
Michelle and I are wondering, can we get back to other binders?
Everyone has their own binders. I can actually see on everyone's shelves that there are multiple forms of stationery doing the rounds today. Lyse, I'm going to give you the last word, and I suppose it's a tricky question, but I just want to leave something in our minds that we can be thinking about in the hours before Donald Trump does his big statement at 9 p.m. US time on Thursday night. I suppose the reason it's a tricky question is we just don't know what way he's going to go. But what would you like us to be thinking about?
I think that as citizens, we have to listen carefully to what the US President and Commander-in-Chief says, but we also have to listen skeptically, ask ourselves, has he said this before? Why is he saying this? Is he, as I think has been pretty well confirmed, is he doing this to move the markets, to bring down oil prices? Is this really, and if he talks about ending the war, whether very soon, winding down, compare it to what is happening on the ground. Don't judge him by what he says, but by what he does.
Very wise words. Lyse, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Michelle, good to catch up with you too.
Thanks, Adam.
And Henry, thanks for the view from Westminster.
Thank you very much, Adam.
And that is all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much to everyone who's been on it. Thanks to you too for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon. And just a reminder, we will be working on our first episode of Election Cast, looking at the campaigns in Scotland, Wales, and the areas of England where the local authorities are up for election. We will be recording that on Thursday morning, and it will appear in your feeds on Friday. See you soon. Bye-bye.